The beginning of the conversation on climate change mitigation and adaptation. We thank you so much for staying with the Daily Report right here on TV47. My name is George Maringa. Before the break, I of course had introduced my guests who are here in studio already. Esther Mutuma, founder and CEO of Boreka Group, is already here in studio sitting to my left. And Boreka Group is a social enterprise using technology to work with communities to accelerate adoption of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and other programs that they also run at Boreka Group. Also joining us from Uganda is Faith Lumonya, Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us. We did tell you it's a ladies' night tonight. We want to hear the sentiments and, of course, the opinions of women, especially on this whole discussion and conversation on matters climate change mitigation and adaptation. We invite you to channel your feedback, especially on X, formerly Twitter, at TV47 News, at George Maringa _ use the hashtag Daily Report. We shall pose your feedback questions to our guests and also be sure to incorporate it in our in our conversation tonight. Thank you so much for staying with us. Earlier on, Faith, you did say, the child, one of the disappointments. I want to pick your minds, especially on what we've seen the President of the Republic doing, using electric cars, e-cars, to travel to KICC. Is this something that perhaps is good news that you'd like to see happening not only in Kenya or even perhaps, or should it, is it something that was perhaps in your mind aesthetics, or would you like it to see it continue?
It's a good thing, yes, because it helps us to deal with reducing emissions. Like we all know, the burning of fossil fuels, which is the diesel and the petrol that we use for running cars, is not good for the environment. So if we could go the electric way, for sure that's a plus, that's a good thing. And it's something we can borrow even from our the developed countries that have adopted it and reduced the amount of emissions that they see on their roads. So it's a plus, and it's something that hopefully even on the public transport is going to get adopted at scale. Okay.
Faith, are we seeing such things happening in Uganda, perhaps in terms of the government leading from the front in such initiatives?
Yes, obviously we have Kira Motors, and Kira Motors is an electric car, and one of the things that have been done during the recent past, within the past few months, has been to basically invest in being able to put in place buses, electric buses, and so they currently provide some level of public transport across the country, majorly within the urban center. And I think it's important, but I think one of the things that we shouldn't forget is that as Africans, as Africa, we are not responsible for causing the climate crisis. And so the responsibility for addressing the climate crisis does not lie with us. It lies with the global north. And so even all these other things that we are doing, we do them because we would like to have a planet that's good for us, an environment that's good for us, but ultimately the responsibility falls on the global north, and we should not forget that. Of course, which I fear is something we are.
Okay. Faith, Esther, you earlier on you mentioned that you work in Kitui with your foundation, and we did see the Senator of Narok, Leda Molekina, saying a real climate change conference should be held in a desert. Then these talks can stop being talks about, quote unquote, nothing. Those are, I'm reading from his tweet. Esther, I'm curious, how is the conversation ongoing, especially in the grassroots level, specifically Kitui County?
Yeah, that's a good point that was raised there. And it's true, seeing is believing. It takes seeing the actual situation on the ground to actually appreciate the impact. We do work in Kitui County, and I'm happy that the highlight story, coincidentally tonight, was on Kitui County. Yes. And for us, it's something we've had to deal with every single day, because we talk to the farmers and they say to us, we don't have the water. What are we going to do when we plant the trees and they start drying up? And it's a real hard situation, because a farmer has to think about, should I get water for my family, for the animals, or for crops? And that's a really difficult situation to be in, and it's a real crisis, and it's only getting worse. Yeah. Okay,
Faith, you mentioned earlier on that the global north is not, the global south is not focusing on what is required specifically. There are several mishaps. When you look at the whole issue, Africa has contributed very little, yet we are sort of at par with the rest of the world. This whole climate financing situation, ideally, what needs to happen?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I think I want to start by saying I work with Akina Mama wa Africa, AMWA, and one of the things that we are doing is to, because we usually have this conversation around gender mainstreaming, but we are saying it's important that we reimagine the usual ways of gender mainstreaming and begin to interrogate systems and structures that are responsible for oppression and exclusion. And to try and answer your question, one of the things that we have seen is that when we get into the conversation around climate financing, a lot of it, we are forgetting that the Paris Agreement was very clear. It talks about common but differentiated responsibilities, acknowledging that yes, we are all responsible in one way or another, but it is not equally. And it also recognizes that the global north, the developed countries, are historically responsible for the climate crisis. I mean, they are responsible for more than 79% of global emissions. And so they are responsible for ensuring that global emissions reduce. But now what we are seeing is that in addition to that, they are responsible for ensuring that climate finance is made available for adaptation and mitigation, among other climate action responses. But now what we are seeing is that because they have not been able to deliver on their commitments, they are now getting all of us involved in that responsibility. And so one of the things that we are saying is that even when you talk about engaging women or bringing the global south onto the table for conversation, we are saying let's be clear on who is responsible for addressing what, because this is it's a global challenge, and so addressing it, we must assign global responsibility to who is responsible for what.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick your mind on now Africa specifically, like Kenya. What are some of the responsibilities that needs to be assigned to Africa?
So, I mean, even when you look at the Paris Agreement, there's no specific responsibility assigned to us as Africa or as countries in the global
of course,
south.
Universal.
The way it is structured is that if we are able to, then we can be able to. So for instance, if we are able to protect forests and ensure that for instance, water is available for our communities and etc., then that's okay, we can be able to do it. If there's certain monies that are available within our budgets that would like to allocate for climate response, that's okay. But the responsibility falls on the global north. But now we are seeing that is shifting because they do not want to meet their commitment. They do not want to be held accountable. And that is where the biggest problem is.
Esther, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, I agree with Faith on the responsibility sharing. But I also want to state that the reality is Africa and Kenya, for instance, the drylands, the Kituis of this world, are the most impacted by the climate change story. So whether the global north wants to take responsibility or not, we still have to deal with the reality of it's our people that are suffering. It's us who are eventually ending up in trouble because we don't have water, we have droughts, we have famines, we have malnutrition, we have all these issues that are coming as a result of climate change. And so we must also think about it for our own good. If the global north did nothing, what happens to us? Do we get, do we all die, or what happens? We've got to think about what responsibility can we take, and not worry too much about what they're not doing, because there's only so much we can do about what they're not doing. Because if they are bound by global conventions like the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement is very clear, not only on the clause 2 and 9, but also on these other clauses on even how they engage with the projects that they engage with the Global South. For instance, the Article 6 does stipulate how we are supposed to manage even carbon projects and carbon-related projects and so on. And that's not actively happening. We just recently got a new Climate Change Act assented to, the new bill we have, and there's still questions around benefit sharing. People are still questioning who should be getting what, when, why. People are still, debating about money. And to me, that's not really the priority. The priority should be, what are we doing to save the planet as stewards of the planet? Because we have no other home. This is the only home.
Yeah, we've seen, governments, we've seen even the Secretary General of the UN fly in, today. We did see John Kerry in the country. It perhaps, one would wonder then, Faith, that you're saying, you have reservations as to their presence because the global north has not done what it needs to be done. However, these people are the same ones, that have most funding in an environment and in a world where things seem unfair. We perhaps would need them, ideally, to be able to borrow technologies. Is that something that, I see you changing your face, but is it something that really, can you do it by ourselves, really? That's the question.
So I wanted to also respond to some of the things that she raised. Right. So yes, COVID-19 showed us that when a catastrophe hits, everyone is on their own. Yeah. It showed us that the global north, even when they have all the resources needed to be able to respond, they will not turn up. Because think about it, they were able to raise about $1 trillion within just a month, or slightly above that. But to respond to the COVID pandemic within their countries. But when it comes to the climate crisis, because they are not the ones who are being affected, then they are not responding. But to also speak about solutions. So yes, we know that to a certain extent we have to respond, because it's our people whose lives are on the line. It's our ecosystems that are being lost. It's our heritage. It's our land. It's our lives that are being lost. But the thing is that in this conversation of us also acting, they are literally transferring responsibility. So they are telling us, set up carbon sinks, so that then they continue to produce and consume the way they would want to produce and consume. And what we are saying is that a real solution would involve them cutting back on the amount of production and extraction and exploitation and the way they consume. They need, because like for instance, now we have a conversation around second-hand clothes, but the US has been pushing back against us banning second-hand clothes because they know that their textile industries will be affected. It's the same thing now they are doing. Put in place carbon sinks, because they know that if there are no carbon sinks, then they can't continue to produce the way they want to produce. And that's what that's where the conversation needs to happen, that they can't be using us the way they have used us all these years. I mean, since colonialism, since the eras of slave trade, this is how things have been. It's been us giving and giving and them extracting and exploiting from us, and that needs to stop.
Okay. Yeah. Esther, even as you respond, perhaps, most of the African countries were, gained their independence, especially in the 20th century. And the Industrial Revolution in some of these countries came in way earlier. So when Africa says that we want, the West, the global North, to stop what it's doing, are we biting more than we can chew by, asking them to stop? Because they've been doing this for years. Is it realistic? Is it even workable? Or are we just, continuing with this talk and talk and talk, but we don't seem, to pretty much well anticipate or expect that I will stop sort of suddenly, so that we are able then to see that this conversation progresses from saying stop doing this, and then now we can say, well, you've started doing this, you've started following the Paris Agreement. Are we biting more than we can chew? I
think, and Faith, to your point that it's been going on and on. And one thing I like to say about these whole climate conversations is, yes, let's walk the talk. Let's walk the talk in the sense that let's start moving towards the direction we want everyone to move. If we are talking about changing into use of renewable energies, if we are talking about reducing emissions, let's do more action as opposed to talking. And the reality is nobody's going to close shop tomorrow just because there's a climate crisis. You know, companies are going to produce the vehicles, the mobile phones. It's a capitalist world.
Profit.
It's very commercial. Everyone wants to make money. So it's not going to stop overnight. But also the way I like to look at this, as Africa has a lot of potential and opportunity to actually be the powerhouse that now tries to solve this crisis.
How? The question is how?
We have what we need, which is land. Land as a natural resource is the most critical resource as far as this climate debate is concerned, as far as the carbon sinks angle to this is concerned. So if we were to focus on restoration and biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, we would move away from this whole crisis of in Kitui 30, 40 years ago, before all the charcoal burning took place, there was a bit of better rain. We used to have katumani maize. I remember I would hear agriculturalists doing katumani and doing a lot of other products in that part of the world. But with years going on and the tree cutting and, you know, turning into charcoal burning and stuff like that, we've lost that. And so we are in a situation where the situation keeps getting worse. And unless we actively start reversing it, we're going to keep talking and we're going to get very little results, if any. I agree, we need to reduce on the consumption. I think globally we consume way more, especially in the developed world. We consume a lot more than we need. And COVID taught us that there are a lot of things that we can reduce on as humanity. And actually, one of the most interesting facts about COVID time was that with a couple of days of lockdown, we started being able to see Mount Kilimanjaro, being able to see Mount Kenya from Nairobi, which meant that there was no much pollution, and that was good for the environment. And it taught us that there are so many things that we can do differently. We don't have to drive all the time to go places. Sometimes we can do things virtually. And as humanity, we need to start adopting that. COVID came to teach us that, hey, come on guys, there's something you can do about this situation. Reduce on your emissions because it's not good for the planet, and start thinking about how you're going to reduce on your commercial, the commercial approach to doing business. We don't need to have a new iPhone every 6 months. We don't need, it's crazy. The world has gone into a production that is simply not sustainable.
You're saying, Faith?
I mean, they produce even their phones. Think about the phones. We should be able to have a phone and it shouldn't get spoiled. Like you should have it for a lifetime. But now they've been developed in such a way that you need a phone every other 2 years. And that then means that there's additional extraction happening because then certain minerals needed to put this phone together have to be extracted. And then there's someone profiting from that process. But I also want to talk about the land and to beg the question of who owns the land. Because also in this carbon sinks conversation, we are forgetting that ultimately when we begin to talk about planting trees, it's not women who are going to benefit from the credits that will come from selling the carbon sinks. But also, when you think about certain countries like Namibia, where a significant proportion of the land is not owned by locals. It's either owned by white settlers who came in as colonizers, or by people who have come in, again, Europeans, and have been able to buy from their other European settlers. And the African people do not own the land. So ultimately, it's a whole big business agenda that they are setting up to be able to profit from this crisis. So I think for me, the land question, there's questions. Do we actually own the land? It's a big question on this continent, even here in Kenya.
Okay. Yeah. Before we come back to the Kenyan situation, then are we asking for sort of a reinvention of the wheel? Because we would want these carbon emissions to go lower, but we've seen all these leaders have flown in jets, they have flown in aircrafts. What then are we saying? Are we also copying what now the global north has been doing?
To be honest, part of the reason why I liked it that the summit was done in Nairobi was that it was ridiculous to see last year lots of leaders go for the UNGA summit, and then a couple of weeks later they are in El Shama Sheikh for the COP, and they were in thousands, and they were all African. And the question for me was, why can we not have this conversation in Africa and then package it and go with a declaration to COP and send a few representatives? Why do we have to have so many people going to COP?
Okay.
And so it's kind of nice to see the conversation happening in Africa. And mark you, this is the very first conversation on climate. And Africa Union, of course, was the convener, which makes sense because, again, we kind of know Africa Union to always be convening meetings to deal with military coups and crises and political stalemates. It's high time that now we start convening meetings to think about the progress of Africa and the development of Africa. And to me, that was a good thing. We hopefully will not be doing it every year. We should try to do it every 2 years, because then it doesn't make sense to have conversations happening and then we have not even had time to take stock on action after the talk. And it's okay that COP is every year, but I honestly think also the approach to doing COP should be a bit taking into consideration that we are climate conscious. We don't want to ban all the jet fuel in the world. But mark you, burning jet fuel is not as big a distraction as burning fuel wood, for instance.
Okay.
And in the case of the women, for us in Africa who are usually using, fuel wood to cook, not only is it bad for the environment, but it's also bad for their health. And that conversation came up today, earlier. And so we are saying, can we look at what is on the table as to what are the good must-dos and should-dos that we should focus on, and not worry too much about the little problems that come with it. For instance, coming together for a summit, yes, we burn a bit of fuel jet to get here, but it's a good conversation. If we can have a position that takes us to COP, and we go to COP and say, yes, we know this is the situation, and we can look as African countries, what is the land situation? Because the land situation in Southern Africa is different from West Africa.
Precisely.
In West Africa, for instance, the chiefs in Ghana own the land. So it's really like, they own the land and they are proud to own the land. In East Africa, for instance, we have the smallholder model. We have the ranches for the Maasai communities and the arid and semi-arid. So it's different. It's one big continent with different regulations and frameworks. But one of the things also I would maybe mention is that as Africans, we need to learn from each other. We need to start asking ourselves, which country, as far as the land issue is concerned, is doing well? For instance, for Kenya, I think we are kind of leading in the pack because we have a very clear land regulatory framework that allows ownership, and it's legal and it's embedded in the Constitution, and it's very difficult to kind of not get the rights out of the land because it's a constitutional matter.
Okay.
And there are so many lessons that other African countries can pick from our model as Kenya on the land issue and maybe adopt it so that they protect themselves. Remember, in our new constitution, one of the things that happened to land was the land that was, Community Land Act, and also the leasehold versus the freehold. Here, if you're a foreigner, you can only have land for so long. After that, it reverts back to government. Exactly. So the countries in Africa that don't have that should actually look at their sisters and brothers and say, what can we borrow so that we solve this issue once and for all? Because again, we must remember who really is suffering. At the end of the day, who's the victim? Who's going to struggle? Whose children are not going to school? Who's suffering the highest rural-urban migration as a result of climate change? Maringa, I think in this country, for instance, a lot of the slums areas where people are coming from the villages, it's because of poverty driven by climate change, if you ask me. Because if I have 2 acres of land in Kitui,
yes,
I planted maize and I didn't get anything, the next thing I do, I call my uncle, my cousin in Nairobi, say, get me, you know, a casual job or whatever, let me move to the city because I have to survive. And so all the young people, to the question of youth, all the young people when they finish high school, they don't have jobs, they move to the cities, and it's just compounding the problem. It's compounding the problem not only for the women, but also for the youth.
You've said it's compounding the problem. After this short break, because we are due for a short commercial break, we will attempt to decompound the problem to try and achieve solutions. We'll also look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I mean, if as a continent you want this to happen, we still have perhaps different currencies. We are still trading differently. We still have differences in how we'll deal with our land acts and issues affecting our continent. So we will interrogate that and much more after the break. I already see your questions. We thank you so much for joining the conversation online. Keep it coming. We shall be throwing it to our guests, Esther Mutuma, founder and CEO of Boreka Group, as well as Faith Lumonya from Uganda, Economic Justice and Action Lead, the Akina Mama of Africa, that is AMWA. Stay with us. We are back in a few minutes.